Great. Aloha, everybody. It is such a privilege to welcome General Whiting here today, Commander of U.S. Strategic Command. So, oh my God, Space Command. I'm off to a great start. Space Command. Strategic and tactical in space. Just the fact that General Whiting is here, has spent his whole time here at the conference, I think it speaks to the importance of the Indo-Pacific region to Space Command, but also the importance of space to the region here, to our deterrence, warfighting, and our relationship with our allies and partners. So for the next 45 minutes here, my aim is to discuss operational challenges in the Indo-Pacific and the nexus with space. We'll focus on warfighting and the changing role of space, the integration of space capabilities and space-enabled effects, and Space Command's priorities and relationships with other commands and with allies and partners. We will save some time at the end for audience questions, so please start putting those together. Sir, I thought I'd start you off with a softball. Venezuela. Last week, General Kane, in talking about Operation Absolute Resolve, noted Space Command's role. So as U.S. forces were approaching Venezuela, the U.S. began layering different effects provided by Space Command, Cyber Command, and others to create a pathway. I'd welcome your comments on Space Command's role and the effects that it brought.
Well, thank you, Carrie, and I really want to thank Kim and the Pacific Forum and for inviting us to be here at the Honolulu Defense Forum. Fantastic event, and so privileged to be here. It was an extraordinary operation. Let's just start with that. Incredible integration of soft capability, conventional capability, cyber capability, space capability, other capabilities. And as the chairman said on 3 January at his press conference with the president and with the Secretary of War, this was a all-domain, multi-domain operation with effects layered in to create avenues and to provide overwatch. And one of the things I want to highlight is that this did not just happen. This is the product of years of work led by some of the senior folks here in this room. We've been working together with regional forces as represented by South Command in that operation, or here in Indo-PACOM in this AOR, with soft capabilities, with cyber capabilities, with space capabilities. We have plans on the table to do those kind of things. And of course, we all know plans are a great starting point. But what they do when a new operation is needed, they may not be the perfect plan, but it allows you to activate a prepared network. And that network then comes together to do the detailed planning for a specific operation on short order. So very proud of the space team who was a small part of that operation, but it truly was a unique operation that I think will go down in the annals of history.
Broadly, it speaks to exactly what you just said, is how is Space Command and how are space effects being integrated more into the joint force, joint planning, joint operations. So can you give us a little bit more into how is that integration going and where is it still hard?
Integration across the joint force has really come leaps and bounds over the last several years. In some theaters like here in Indo-PACOM, those terrestrial warfighters, they deeply understand their dependency and the threats that space bring to them. I want to give Indo-PACOM great credit. There are some organizations here, I think it was initially largely led out of PAC Fleet, but certainly with incredible representation from USERPAC, from the Marine component, from the Air component, and now with the Space Force Indo-PAC. They have done the most sophisticated thinking and planning about how space and terrestrial operations have to come together to be successful. And we've seen that, again, to varying levels depending on what threats other combatant commands are facing. But it is now routine, it's regular, and I don't have to, break down doors to get space into the planning. I don't have to convince other senior leaders about why space is important, because it's an existential issue in places like Indo-PACOM.
Well, and let's unpack that a bit. The theme of this conference is operationalizing readiness. Admiral Paparo talked this morning about he has instructed the PLA to be militarily ready by 2027. So let's link that to space. What does the PLA's military readiness in the space domain look like? I think we want to impress upon this audience just how significant their activity has been. And then how do you link it to what's happening here in the region and on the ground?
Yeah, myself and others have said that China is moving breathtakingly fast in space. And I'm upgrading that language, I think, this year to say they're moving jaw-droppingly fast in space. And let me hit 3 specific areas, and then a 4th that I may have to start adding into this. First, China has developed a suite of counter-space weapons that run the gamut, everything from non-kinetic to kinetic, terrestrial and in-domain. That's cyber attack capability. It's EW capability against SATCOM and GPS. It's directed energy lasers. It's direct-to-send ASAT weapons, and then it's in-domain counter-ASAT satellites, or ASAT satellites, co-orbital satellites. So that's number 1. Number 2 is China has studied us very carefully for over 35 years, back to Desert Storm, and they've seen how space is a force enabler for the entire joint force. I think General Denaro in his panel said, space increases the lethality of the joint force. So China is now going to space, hundreds upon hundreds of satellites to make the PLA Army, the PLA Air Force, the PLA Navy, PLA Rocket Force, and their Marine Corps capability more precise, more lethal, and more far-ranging. Third, China has built this C5 ISRT system, a space-based targeting system, to find, fix, track, and target U.S. forces operating in the Indo-Pacific. So if your Air Force is trying to do, agile combat employment in the first and second island chain, if your Navy forces trying to maneuver big decks to the Western Pacific, if your Army forces, Marine forces trying to maneuver in the first and second island chain, they have built a C5 ISRT system to find you. So those are the 3 areas I say they move jaw-droppingly fast. But the 4th is, over the last 6 months, you may have seen in the press, in the Chinese press, that they have been doing on-orbit demonstrations of refueling and potentially servicing operations. SJ-21 and SJ-25. One of those is a robotic satellite. The other is a refueling servicing satellite. And we saw them come together and operate together for months at a time. Again, Chinese media said they were doing refueling, perhaps servicing operations. But China may be developing an on-orbit maneuver capability that's refuelable. And so that's something they're moving very fast in as well.
So C4ISRT and counter C4ISRT, big topic and focus in this combatant command. I want to unpack both dimensions to that. A universal observation with recent conflicts, whether in operations U.S. and Venezuela, Russia against Ukraine, Israel strikes against Iran, the other side goes after our eyes, our ears, our ability to communicate. So given what you just said, in Indo-PACOM, so much of that C4 ISRT rides on space. How are you thinking about the durability of it and defending that capability?
Yeah, it's a critical aspect of what we are doing at U.S. Space Command, defending our long-range blue kill chains. Typically, the United States fights as an away game, and we fight untethered to terrestrial networks. So that means we are having to leverage space to do the find, fix, track, as well as the communicate, the targeting. And so we collectively have to defend that. Certainly, we think we in Space Command have a big role in that. But if others are looking just to Space Command to defend that, that will be inadequate. Yes, we need capabilities in space, but it is a whole joint force problem. And again, it has to be multi-domain and layered. That includes cyber effects, it includes EW, it includes terrestrial fires from all domains. And it's going to take all of that for us to be able to sustain these long-range blue kill chains that allow us to operate anywhere we need to around the globe.
And then to your earlier point, in terms of China's increasing focus on their own ISR and C4 capabilities, you and I are now going to have a public conversation here that we never would be able to 5, 10 years ago. We have to be able to target that. And so we're now no longer talking about taking punches and defending against it, but we're now talking about throwing punches in space. So how is Space Command thinking about going on offense?
You know, we're fortunate in the space domain in that we can look at our sister domains and the traditional military services, some of which have been around for hundreds of years. You know, just last year we celebrated the 250th birthday of the United States Army, the United States Navy, the United States Marine Corps, and we can learn all these lessons. Some of those lessons have been instituted in the joint doctrine. And in joint doctrine, there's something called the joint functions. And the joint functions are things that you have to be able to do in each domain to be successful. And number one on the joint functions is fires. And so I say I need integrated space fires. I have to have the ability to influence targets. And influence is a broad word, everything from non-kinetic to kinetic. And I need space weapon systems that allow me to influence targets. So that's the first thing I need. Then I need the other 6 joint functions as well. See if I can get them all out. But intelligence, command and control, information, movement and maneuver, protection and sustainment. I've got to have all of that in space if we're going to be successful against the threats that we now see arrayed against us.
And that's a very different way of thinking than we have thought about in space before. So you meant space maneuver, joint fires. Can you unpack a bit more for us? What does that look like, and what is the demand signal that you're sending as a combatant command to your services, to industry, to help you in those areas?
Yeah, maybe let me answer that about maneuver, and then come back if you want to talk more about some of the other ones. But the ironic thing is, in space, everything's in motion. You've probably heard, in low Earth orbit, everything's moving 17,000 miles per hour. And even in geosynchronous orbit, where it looks like a satellite right above the equator is staying in a singular spot, it's all in motion. Yet, if we're making an analogy to terrestrial warfare, it's like we're preparing the Maginot Line. Everything is essentially static because those orbits are energy constant or energy neutral. And very, very rarely do we maneuver out of the orbit that Kepler is just putting us in by the very nature of physics. So that means we're fighting from static positions. And, a hallmark of U.S. military operations is we fight maneuver warfare. And in fact, there's a number of historical examples, the Maginot Line being one, where incredibly, exquisitely prepared static and fortified forces will lose to maneuver capabilities if those maneuver capabilities have the right doctrine, have the right training, have the right capabilities. I want to get to maneuver warfare in space. Where we are today would be like if you're a naval officer, I'm making this up, but imagine we gave you 10 DDGs and we said you're going to get 1 tank of gas, you're going to have all the armament we can put on it to begin with, and now I need you to operate that without refueling or without rearming for the next 5 to 7 years. Every decision you make would then become about saving fuel. And a psychology of scarcity would set in. You wouldn't trust your ship's captain because you can't trust him or her now to decide when they got to train their forces. That fuel is too precious. So you're going to pull up that decision making to a higher level. You're not going to enable mission command. And you're going to, be subject to the maneuver forces of others. So we've got to get to a place in the space domain where we are fighting maneuver warfare, where I can maneuver without regret. If I need to move a satellite for the reasons we do in the Joint Force, which is to gain positional advantage, I do it. And I don't worry about the fuel I burn because I can then refuel. And that's going to take on-orbit logistics. It's going to take refuelers. And not every mission has to be, refuelable. Proliferated low Earth constellation like Starlink doesn't need to be refuelable, but things in geosynchronous orbit, we can't sustain those from the rear. That's 22,000 miles away. We need to sustain in domain so we can execute maneuver warfare for advantage.
And if I can ask, how has that message been received by all of your different stakeholders? Because that's sometimes the space community, we get critiqued, oh, you're just focused on space wars. But there's a direct connectivity between everything you just said and the joint activity on the ground, working with the services, your overseers, do they resonate with what you just said?
I think intellectually, by and large, yes. I think people can recognize that we want to be able to maneuver for advantage and maneuver away from threat and not be constrained by only having the fuel and the capabilities we ever launched with. There's a broader discussion about how do you pay for that. If we do a mental exercise prior to October of 1957, I don't know that the Department of Defense spent any money on space, but then Sputnik happened. And now I think somewhere today we spend somewhere about 3.5% of the DoD budget on space. Most of that in the Space Force, but certainly the other services have investments in space as well. If we project ourselves 50 years into the future and think about what kind of capabilities we need as the United States goes back to the moon, onto Mars, out to the perhaps out to the asteroids, and then we think about the kind of capabilities like a maneuver warfare capability we need, I think we would say that we're going to have to spend more than 3.5% in the future. So I think it's a matter of prioritization and budget right now, less intellectual agreement that that's the kind of capability we need in the future.
Well, so I asked you earlier about what the PLA's military readiness in the space domain looks like. Let me flip it to us. So what does our own military readiness in space look like? And what are you prioritizing, particularly over the next years? We reach 2027, but also longer term.
You know, while space has some unique aspects, we fold right into the joint processes. And there's a joint readiness process, the DERS system. I'm sorry, I don't remember what DERS stands for off the top of my head. You know, we leverage that to assess our readiness on a monthly, quarterly, annual basis, just like Indo-PACOM does for its forces. But at U.S. Space Command, as we're developing our O-plans, we're thinking in terms of what are the elements we need to be successful. If I could, I'll just highlight what we think the 5 elements of victory that we need to be successful. Number one, we think the most stressing scenario would be an attack by an undeterred adversary. So we've got to be able to operate through a first strike by an undeterred adversary. And that's thinking about things like our backup locations, our COOP locations, resilience in the architecture, command and control to make sure we can continue to operate. Number two, we have to be able to transition quickly from crisis into conflict. If we take a punch from an undeterred adversary and then we have to stop and pause and go start having a conversation about authorities, about where our capabilities are deployed, we have some access basing and overrights concerns as well, even though in space that's that's not sovereign territory. Or if we haven't rehearsed the kind of operations we might have to execute after an undeterred attack on us, we'll be behind. So we've got to be able to transition quickly. We need to do all that left of situation. Third, space is a team sport. You know, no one command, no one service, no one agency, no one country is going to do all that we have to do alone. So we've got to be able to command and control this broad set of stakeholders. And I think that's a unique responsibility for U.S. Space Command at a global level. So we've got to have those command and control capabilities in place to integrate across this joint combined commercial and interagency set of stakeholders that we have. Then fourth, I think there is a presumption that a space war will be short and sharp. And I don't think that's true. I think we've got to be able to sustain our capabilities, redeploy, reconstitute our capabilities for a long fight. So we've got to focus on sustainment as number 4. And then number 5, we've got to achieve space superiority. And that's kind of a culmination of the previous 4, but it also has its own focus areas. Space is so vast, I don't think I can assure all the other combatant commanders that we will have space superiority at all places in space at all times, but we certainly can get it at the times and places that we need to enable our operations and also prevent RED's operations in those times and locations. So those are the 5 things that we think about that we need, and we're kind of always assessing our readiness relative to that.
Well, and then related to that, the theme operationalizing deterrence. How are you thinking about operationalizing deterrence? And there was discussion this morning. A large part of that is presence. So when you think about presence, when you think about campaigning, what does space campaigning look like? How are you integrated with joint campaigning?
Yeah, campaigning is something that we're deeply focused on, and General Flynn sitting here in the front row gave me a tutorial on that about 18 months ago that I still refer back to with my staff. And for me, there are 3 primary outcomes of campaigning, and then I'll talk about some of the campaign activities. Number 1, we want to set conditions in the AOR. If we have to think about transitioning to conflict, we want to have set the conditions to be as, like I said, as seamless in that transition as possible. Number 2, we want to deter conflict. That is a primary responsibility of combatant commands, and so we always want to be taking actions that limit the opportunity for for war to break out in space or to extend into space. We do not think war in space is inevitable, and we want to continue that every day is not the day that a war in space starts. And then third, we want to reduce risk if we have to execute our O-plan for space operations, that we've minimized any risk that may be there. So that's what we're doing. We have an approved campaign plan, and at the joint staff level, they help us integrate those campaign plans with the other combatant commands. So there are global campaigning. We do some of those with our allies and partners. In fact, you may have seen over the last year or so that U.S. Space Command has publicly talked about 3 different campaigning operations we've done with some of our Operation Olympic Defender allies. We've done those as bilateral operations with a wrapper of all 7 nations inside of OOD supporting us, and those 7 nations are Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain, France, and Germany. And so we're operating together to demonstrate that interoperability in space. And then one last point. It is not uncommon that my command is going to be doing some campaigning activity, and we know, hey, this has a equity for Indo-PACOM, for example. And in those cases, either I will call Admiral Paparo directly, or I'll ask my staff to ensure that he's briefed in on it. And every time I find out the staffs have already been working those things together. And then conversely, there's been campaigning by other geographic combatant commanders where that commander calls me or his staff comes to my staff and says, hey, want to make sure you're tracking this. We think you have an equity. And again, it's always been integrated in advance, and we're always, thumbs up, let's proceed.
So I'm going to shift gears a bit and maybe get a little wonky here. I want to talk about operationalizing the combatant command and service relationships with Space Command, because I'll admit sometimes even I get kind of lost in all these different dynamics. So I can envision China scenarios that involve multiple combatant commands, Indo-PACOM focused on the regional fight, NORTHCOM on Homeland Defense, Space Command. And when Space Command was stood up, there was a debate. Is it a functional command or geographic command? Space is a place, so you have a geographic AOR as well. So how do these supported and supporting relationships work day to day, and then how do they work in crisis?
Yeah, U.S. Space Command, we are a supporting and a supported command, and we have a mantra that we use internal that we want to be like Transcom when we're a supporting command. If any of you have ever been through Headquarters Transportation Command at Scott Air Force Base, they say, in fact, I think they have patches, we are an ING command, and they care so much, they say their success is only built upon the success of others. And so when we're supporting, like Indo-PACOM in operations here in the Pacific, we have to embrace that we are there to make them successful. That's why we put a joint integrated space team, which is my liaison element, inside Headquarters Indo-PACOM. They sit here persistently, 15 to 20 people integrated across that staff to make sure there is no daylight between us and them. But there are times that Space Command will be a supported command, and we've got to be ready to execute those responsibilities. So if we think about a fight here in the Western Pacific, obviously Admiral Paparo and Indo-PACOM would be the supported command. But even in the midst of that operation, there could be operations where, for example, we need to achieve space superiority where I'm going to be the supported commander for those activities. And Admiral Paparo and his team understand that, and we rehearse that regularly. In fact, I think every Tier 1 exercise since I've been in the seat the last 2 years at U.S. Space Command, we've had those at the exact same time in the exact same scenario with Indo-PACOM, almost always with Cybercom, SOCOM, and other combatant commands. So we rehearse this regularly, and it's really, really important. And then let me give you one more just cool time that we're going to be the supported commander. You may be tracking that within the next few weeks, NASA is going to launch the Artemis II mission. And this will be the first time in over 50 years that mankind has gone back to the moon. Now, humans are not going to walk on the surface for Artemis II. They're going to orbit and then come back. And in fact, it'll be the first time a non-American goes to the moon. A Canadian astronaut, Royal Canadian Air Force colonel, will be a part of that crew. Well, when that comes back, I'm the supported commander for human spaceflight support. Indo-PACOM will have command and control of those rescue forces. So think back to the video of Apollo coming home, capsule under the parachutes. It lands in the Pacific. Naval forces are there, supported by air forces and others. Indo-PACOM will do that command and control, and they do that in support of me as the supported overall commander for human spaceflight support.
Okay, great. Space is the one unique area across our entire military forces where you have a warfighting combatant command that has an AOR, but you also have a service. So how does that work in practice, say when forces, service, you have all the service components here, they're presenting forces to a combatant command. So you have an Indo-PACOM Space Forces element here, but then Space Command also has a responsibility. So how is that actually working?
Yeah, it is unique. It's the only pairing of a service and a combatant command focused on the same domain. If we go back to 2019, prior to August of 2019, the nation just decided we are not where we need to be in space. We did not have a combatant command whose sole focus was space. STRATCOM had done a good job with with space, but they had, of course, nuclear deterrence. They had NC3. At one point, they had cyber. They had missile defense, and even General Hyten, the commander of STRATCOM, who was a space officer, said, "Hey, on its best day, space is my third priority." And then the U.S. Air Force had built a great space capability, probably the world's best, but by 2019, it was not good enough for the environment we found ourselves in, so the Space Force was created. Now, I mentioned that I have liaison elements at every other combatant command. We modeled that off of what Cyber Command did, and we think it's one of the smartest things we've ever done because, again, I have joint teams persistently working inside every other combatant command to make sure we're as integrated as possible. The Space Force, doing what services do, has created or is in the process of creating components in every combatant command. And I think their most robust one is here in Indo-Pacom. At least that's my external observation. And those components do a couple things. Number one, the commander, General Denaro, he's the senior guardian here assigned to Indo-Pacom and has those kind of Title X responsibilities to Admiral Paparo for all assigned and attached Space Force forces. And then Space Force Indo-Pac has to provide command and control of all presented capabilities. Now, today that typically are things like terrestrial space electronic warfare. We all agree those capabilities tend to have theater-wide, not global, effects. And so, who better to have those than the local Space Force commander, who then can operate those on behalf of the supported geographic combatant commander. But the other services might have space EW too. The Army has those capabilities. Marines are developing those capabilities. The Navy, and then that Space Force component gives Admiral Paparo, and this is his decision, gives him a headquarters that if he so chooses, he could designate and say, hey, Space Force Indo-Pac commander, you're my theater joint force space component commander, and I want you to operate or provide either synchronization or take-on authority over these other service forces, much like we do with a JFAC or a JFMIC or a JFLEC. So it is a unique relationship. We work that relationship regularly, and I think overall it's very positive.
Okay, so we can't have a conversation on space weapons and warfare without mentioning Golden Dome and space-based interceptors. So I can imagine Space Command will have some sort of role, probably an operational responsibility for the space layer. Can you talk about Space Command's role, what you're doing to prepare for that potential operational responsibility? But then I'll also weave in a technology component to this. We just had a panel on AI. You have phenomenal industry partners here in the room. What do you need them thinking about? What do you need them investing in? Because, this is a very dynamic battle space and battle management challenge for you going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. The President's executive order on Golden Dome, incredibly farsighted, and thinking about these space-enabled threats that now we want to protect the American citizen against. And as you noted, in the executive order, it talks about the need for enhanced tracking from space of these kind of threats. Ballistic missile threats, hypersonic threats, hyperglide threats, things like fractional orbital bombardment systems, multiple orbital bombardment systems. It talks about space-based interceptors, a clear delineation that we need these space-based effectors to help in this area. So Space Command is really proud to be a part of the team that's working this. General Mike Gutlein, the direct report program manager, of course, has lead, but we partnered with NORAD Northcom to write a requirements document for Golden Dome that's been delivered to General Gutlein. We're working on concepts of operations. General Gio, my good friend at Northcom, we've partnered on making a proposal about how best to align global missile defense capabilities to support a future Golden Dome. And so as these capabilities get delivered, I would expect, since we're the combatant command responsible for the space AOR, that capabilities delivered into that AOR will be under our responsibility. And then we've got to protect and defend this system to ensure that it's there on the moments that the United States needs it.
So I have two more questions for you, and then I'll open it up to the group here. Operationalizing external partnerships. Space is still an area that benefits from strong bipartisan support, engagement with allies and partners, and an expanding space technology ecosystem. So we've heard from allies and partners, many of whom are in the room, particularly in this region. They're really stepping up in space with capabilities, budget growth. We want our allies to do more. So what do we need from them? What do they need from us? And then from an operational perspective, what do you see as the biggest, say, opportunity and barrier here in working with our foreign partners?
Yeah, I'll just echo Admiral Paparo when he talked about these partnerships, are a center of gravity for us, truly a unique capability that we have. And space is a place we've long executed with our international partners. In fact, as a second lieutenant 35 years ago, the first non-commissioned officer I ever supervised was a Canadian Air Force sergeant assigned to our space unit. And so, we've been working this from the jump. So let me say from an American perspective, what I want to see from our allies, and then I think you asked what our allies want from us, and I'll guess at what that might be. But from an American perspective, I want to see our allies continue to increase their investment in space. And the good news is if you go read their most recent national security strategies or their equivalent of that, almost every one of them are significantly increasing their investment in space, recognizing that it's an important critical national security economic issue for them. They all have also reorganized their military in some way, shape, or form, normally to both improve their operations and also their organized, train, and equip. And we want to see that continue. And then through those investments, we want to see them deliver additive capability. Some of our partner nations have invested over the years. They certainly have given us manpower, but it's largely been into our architectures. And I think as they now invest in their own systems, that's additive to our systems, and that will increase our ability to operate as a coalition. And then third, we just ask for the continued teamwork of our allies. We're better when we operate together, and we think that's been a great force multiplier for us.
Operationalizing the private sector, what do you need from your industry partners here?
I think we put out an integrated priority list, and I'll just hit the top 5 on that. And this is our FY28. We're already working into FY28, thinking about what that budget will be like. Number 1, I need integrated space fires, the ability to affect targets. Number 2, I need active defenses for orbital capabilities. So think about some of our legacy constellations built before the threats we now see became operational. We've got to defend those for several more years while their lifetime continues on orbit. Number 3, I need enhanced domain awareness. Yep, we've got great SDA capability, but is it good enough to give us the target quality track we need to feed a blue kill chain? Number 4, I need a resilient command and control. And number 5, I need the space maneuver capabilities and in-domain logistics that we talked about earlier.
Okay, super. Let me open it up to the audience here. Are there any questions for General Whiting? Man, I covered all the questions. I can't do it.
General Whiting, thank you so much for your service. When you think about, and I think this is especially important to you, integrating data across all forces, whether it's federated, integrated, or harmonized data to provide the artificial intelligence that you're going to need to provide that in-moment operation that you're describing. How far along do you think you are in your data capabilities? And where would you put yourself on a 0 to 10 scale, and what's your kind of North Star?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Our mission areas are data rich. There's a lot of data. That's how we, essentially talk to our satellites, get information back. It's in data streams. But integrating that, visualizing that, and then bringing AI ML tools as we aggregate that, I think we're at 2 moving to 3. Now I say that, and that sounds bleak, but I do feel like we're right at the knee in the curve now. The Department of War has made some enterprise level decisions where I think we have now stable funding looking forward. We have platforms to aggregate that data and now to bring AI ML tools. And so our challenge in our headquarters is now getting all of our action officers to begin to use this as part of their workflows and design workflows around this to take advantage of it. So I see us making great progress, but I think we're still in the early stages.
Yeah. Hello? 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 Hello?
I think it came on right at the end there.
Hello? Hello?
Yep, you're good.
Can you hear me? Anton LaGuardia of The Economist. I wanted to tease out a little bit more from you, if I may, on the interplay between the space domain and the terrestrial domain, particularly in this warfighting prospect. In other words, you spoke about the long-distance kill chains that you have to protect. To do that and to degrade the REDS long-distance kill chains, will you have to go after terrestrial targets as well as defend in and around space? And second of all, what are the neutrals in space, given the amount of commercial satellites up in space? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. When we think about space systems, we think of them in terms of having three segments. There's the space segment, the satellite. There's the ground segment, where you command those satellites from or through, for example. And then there's the link segment that links that ground site to the space sites. You know, we've got to protect all three of those on our blue side, and we've got to be thinking about all three of those as we think about REDS space systems. And then you highlighted, I think you asked the question, are there neutrals in space? You know, I think by the Outer Space Treaty, space is not sovereign territory, although each individual country is responsible for all the space systems that come from that country. But certainly we want to preserve the domain, ensure that it remains sustainable long term. And so that's why, for example, the United States screens every active satellite against every piece of debris on orbit, and we provide warnings out to every country on Earth, including Russia and China. You may say, hey, Whiting, why are you sending Russia and China those notifications? Because we don't want one of their satellites to hit a piece of debris and then create more debris, because that's the environment we have to live in. And perhaps unlike other domains, you know, if you sink a ship, it's going to go to the bottom of the ocean. If you shoot down an airplane, it falls out of the sky. But if we create more debris in space, it largely just stays there until years and years later, when gravity eventually pulls it back into the Earth's atmosphere. Sometimes that's decades or hundreds of years. So we want to be very precise and discriminate in our operations in space and make sure it's sustainable going forward.
Hi, I'm Mira Resnick from Saronic. We produce autonomous boats. For allies and partners that would not have access to Starlink, how should they be thinking about capability that relies on SATCOM among other communications?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Starlink is representative of a proliferated low Earth orbit constellation, P-LEO, and it's a technological advancement that I think has shifted the assumptions about SATCOM. You know, SATCOM traditionally has been provided from geosynchronous orbit, very large satellites, very expensive, perhaps what General Hyten had in mind when he talked about big juicy targets a decade ago that we had in space. And P-LEO changes the assumption and has been very resilient and survivable in a number of different environments. And so while Starlink is the first of those P-LEOs, I think there's other companies, certainly other U.S. companies, and I've read about European companies, Canadian companies that are considering doing the same. And so I don't think you're confined to just using Starlink, but P-LEO certainly is a global capability with high resilience. And I think those countries should be looking at those kinds of capabilities to fulfill their requirements.
Is there one more question, and then I want to give the general the last word. Over to my right.
Thanks. My name is Courtney Stewart. I'm from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. I just wanted to ask you, if you had unlimited budget, you weren't shackled by political sensitivities, what does optimal space integration look like for fires? Thank you.
Can you give me just a little bit more, because I want to try to get at your question?
Well, what does it look like when you say integrated fires in space? What does that perfect picture look like from your perspective?
Okay, thank you. And so the term I use is integrated space fires. And what I mean by that is I need to be able to affect targets. And that will come with all kinds of capabilities. This is a whole of joint force requirement. Again, some will be in domain, some will be terrestrial, some will be cyber, some will be traditional or improved and enhanced terrestrial fires coming from our Navy, our Army, our Air Force, our Marine Corps. All of that together working as a system informed by intelligence that helps us to achieve the effects we need. So it's really, when I say integrated space fires, it's talking about all the capabilities from across the joint force that help us affect those kinds of targets.
What I think is interesting, and I'll bring it back to where we started this morning with Admiral Paparo, is he said the limiting factor of our strategy is distance, and space capabilities are what bridge that distance, particularly with the distributed maneuver forces we have at air, sea, on ground, etc. The two areas that really, the game has really changed now going forward, it is in what you just said, is it's the effects piece, and it's no longer thinking about space as just satellites orbiting, delivering ISR, delivering PNT, but think about in the air domain at sea, you can deliver non-kinetic effects through that domain, you can deliver kinetic effects. And so now, how do we look at the space domain that way? As well as when you look at what China's doing, as you said, sir. I mean, we have to figure out now how to target and hold at risk their ability to use space against us. So those two areas really have changed the game for, I think, the space domain and why your command exists. I want to give you the last word here. What haven't we covered, but also maybe a challenge to this group here. If there's one change that you'd want to make, policy, organization, budget, whatever, that would most improve deterrence in the Indo-Pacific here over the next, say, 2 years, what would it be?
I think I'll channel Admiral Kaler from the last session there. We need to deliver capability at speed. We need to deliver capability that makes our systems more resilient, to deny the benefit of a potential attack against them. We also need to speed up the delivery of effectors so that we can impose costs if somebody were to attack us. And I think that is something understood across the Department of War. In fact, the Secretary of War just last week was at Rocket Lab out in I think Long Beach area, LA area. And today he's going to be at SpaceX down in Brownsville, looking at these companies that are striving to really deliver that capability. But we need the entire space commercial sector, which is a massive advantage for the United States, not just for those of us in the space world, but for us as a nation. But we got to deliver capability to make sure that we can be as resilient as possible and have the capabilities we need to demonstrate peace through strength.
Well, General Whiting, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your leadership of the joint force at U.S. Space Command, and thanks for everything that you do to continue to allow us to maintain U.S. leadership and military advantage in space.
Thank you, Carrie.